Okay, welcome back, and welcome back to all of you joining us in studying God's Word. So, before we look at your homework today, let's think through what are the 9 steps that you have to go through to exegete narrative. What are the 9 steps?
Pray.
Pray.
Read before and after.
Read before and after, which means what?
Read what happens before the story and what happens after the story.
How many chapters?
5.
5 on each side, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, what's the next one?
The boundaries.
Oh yeah, figure out where the story starts and ends.
Okay.
And then you figure out who the main characters are.
Okay.
And then the arrangement of the story.
Good.
And then focusing questions.
Okay.
And then the exegetical central idea.
Okay.
And then move from the exegetical central idea to the theological central idea.
Good.
To the lesson central idea.
Good.
And then you connect from their time to now.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So, going through our list there, and why do we have that list on the left side of the picture?
Because that's where Israel is. That's where the mud huts are.
Okay.
On the left side.
Okay, and we're trying to understand what it meant to them before we try to figure out how it applies to us today, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. And yesterday we looked at reading before and after, and we had 4 questions, or 4 things to observe with reading before and after. Do you remember what they were? Okay, how do the surrounding chapters relate to your story? How are they connected to your story? In what social or religious setting does this story take place? And what do we mean by social and religious?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, social has to do with the rank of people and whether they are poor or rich, king, shepherd. Where does this take place as far as, does it take place in a palace, in a village? Thinking of the social structure. And then religious setting, does this take place in the temple? Does it take place again out in the field? Is this in some other religious place? What is the geographical setting of the story that refers to?
Whether it's in Russia or Israel or America or...
Okay. Well, the stories in the Bible don't take place in Russia.
Yeah.
Okay. But yes. Then, why do you think the author decided to tell the story? And what are we looking at there?
What was the purpose of telling the story and why he told it there instead of in some other place?
Good. Good. Very good. Now, for today, you were supposed to read chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. And you were supposed to determine the boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. Step 3. And you're supposed to see how many stories we have here. So what did you come up with?
3 stories.
3 stories. Okay, what are the boundaries?
The first starts in chapter 4, verse 1.
Okay.
And ends, I think, in chapter 4, verse 22.
Okay. And what's that story about?
About the battle between the Israelites and how the ark got captured and what happened because of that.
Okay, good.
And then the next story is chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 2.
Okay.
That's what happened with the Ark of the Covenant in Philistia and how they sent it back to Israel and what happened after that.
Okay, good. Good. So it was trouble with the ark in Philistia, right? Good. So what's the third story?
Chapter 7, verse 3 through chapter 7, verse 17.
Okay.
And that's about Samuel's judgment of Israel and some of what he did as a judge.
Okay. Now, what are the connections between those stories? I know, I didn't tell you to be looking for those, but you probably saw some connections, right?
No.
No? Well, in chapter 4, the ark gets captured, right?
Well,
Chapters 5,
yeah.
6, and 7 is about the ark in the land of the Philistines, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 7 is about Samuel telling Israel to put away their foreign gods and to follow God with all their heart.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 4, they lost to the Philistines and the Ark of the Covenant was taken. In chapter 7, Samuel says, turn back to the Lord and see what the Lord will do. And what happened?
They defeated the Philistines.
They defeated the Philistines. Right. There's a lot more connections between those, but all of that to say that all those stories go together. In fact, you have in chapter 4, it's almost like a sandwich. In chapter 4, you have the ark being captured and Israel defeated. In chapter 7, you have Israel defeating the Philistines, but without the ark. And in the middle, you have this very strange story about the ark in the land of the Philistines. And that has to do with arrangement. Why did he decide to put those stories where they were? So, now, today, we're going to look a little bit more at steps 3 and 4. Step 3, identify the boundaries. Now, you just did that with these 3 stories, and that was a good job. And I agree, 3 stories there. Okay? Now, we want to do more than finding out where does the story start and stop. That's the first thing we want to find out. Where does the story start and stop? And you found that out. That was good. But we also want to find out what are the major sections of the story. And here's what we're going to be looking for. Background. Background of a story gives us some information that kind of gives us the setting of the story. Sometimes a story has a lot of background. Sometimes a story just gets straight into the action and just skips the background. Like maybe the previous chapter was the background. Then you have the crisis. And you probably remember learning about this in some of your literature classes. Stories follow this pattern. What's the crisis? The crisis is where the action begins in the story. That's where things start happening in the story. It's not just telling about this happened in this place, blah, 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 but the action begins. You start seeing things taking place. And under crisis, you have what's called rising tension and climax. So the crisis is a problem in the story. It's what starts the story moving, and that's what keeps you interested in the story. If we were just learning about someone going from here to here to here to here, that does not make a very interesting story. The crisis or the problem, is the unanswered issue, is what keeps us reading. And good stories have that. And the Bible has really good stories. So there's a problem. And so we keep reading. That's the crisis. That keeps our attention. And that crisis is something that usually the main character has to respond to. They can try to respond to it, and if their response doesn't work, it increases the tension of the crisis. And so you have what's called rising tension. So oftentimes in Scripture, you'll have a problem, and they'll say, oh, we'll solve it this way. And they try it, and it doesn't work. And so that builds the tension in the story, doesn't it? In fact, you can see right here in the story that you read for yesterday, the Philistines and the ark. It says that in chapter 5, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So what's their solution? So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord, with the God of Israel?" They answered, "Let the ark of God of Israel be brought round to Gath." So what's their solution?
They send it to a different
They send
city.
it to a different city. Right. And what happens? So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there, but after they brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing a very great panic. So you have rising tension. Oh no, that solution didn't work. So then they try another solution. And it goes around throughout the land of the Philistines for how many months? 7 months. Chapter 6, verse 1. The ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. Okay, so that's the rising tension. Then you come to the climax. That is like the peak tension. And what's the peak tension in that story? They come up with another solution.
Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people.
Right. Chapter 6, verse 8. And take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart. Verse 7. Now then, take and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows on which there has never come a yoke, and yoke the cows to the cart, but take their calves home away from them. And take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart and put it in a box at its side, the figures of gold, which you are returning to him as a guilt offering. Then send it off and let it go its way, and watch. If it goes up on the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, then it is he who has done us this great harm. But if not, then we shall know that it is not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by coincidence. So here's their climax. Here's what they're going to do. Their final test to make sure that this was from God, that they were going to put it on this ark, they're going to put it on this cart, and they were going to yoke 2 cows to the cart that had never been in a yoke before. In other words, they'd never learned to pull a cart. Now, it takes work to teach a cow how to pull a cart so that it doesn't fight it and fight the other cow. Beyond that...
Though that wouldn't be as much of a problem with female cows, right?
Yeah, it would. Oh. Especially with these cows. Because what did they do?
They take away their calves.
They took away their calves. Now, what's a mama cow want to do?
Go to its
It baby. Wants to go to its baby. So they take away the calves, and they yoke these cows together to a cart, and most cows would go crazy and destroy the yoke, the cart, and each other trying to get back to their calves. So this is the climax. This is their solution. Let's see what happens. And the cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh along one highway, lowing as they went. They turned neither to the right nor to the left.
I don't want to go, but I've got to.
Yep, and they just went straight. Okay, so that's the climax. Okay, they are yoking the cows to this cart. They're trying to get rid of this problem in their cities. They yoke the cow to this cart, and they're seeing, is this really from the God of Israel, or is this just coincidence? And sure enough, it's not coincidence. This is from the God of Israel. The cows do what cows would normally not do. Okay, so then you come to the resolution. After the crisis, the resolution is, how do things end up? Do they end up working out? What's the aftermath? And then finally you come to the conclusion. Now it's important to note these different sections. Finding these different sections help you figure out, okay, this is how the author laid out the story. Now the 4th step is to look at the main characters. Do you know what a protagonist is?
The main character.
Okay, the main character or the hero of the story, the one that the story is about. And usually we're looking there at the human main character. God shows up in almost every story, or he's behind the scenes at least in almost every story. Even in the book of Esther, though he's never mentioned in the book of Esther, he's behind the scenes. The opposite of the protagonist is the antagonist. I shouldn't say the opposite, but they're like the enemy of the protagonist, is the antagonist, because you have pro and you have anti. Anti is against. Okay? So protagonist and you have the antagonist. Now the antagonist can be a person, like in the story of David and Goliath. Who's the antagonist?
Goliath.
Okay, good. Or the problem can be a situation. The antagonist can be a problem situation. It doesn't have to be a person. Then there's a foil. That's a character in the story. It's not every story has a foil, but you'll find a lot of stories do. A foil is someone who does the opposite of the main character. For example, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah does the opposite of Ruth, right? Ruth goes with Naomi. Orpah goes back to her people. She does what's expected. Ruth goes beyond. Same thing with the kinsman and Boaz. In chapter 4, Boaz says, redeem Ruth. And the kinsman says, I can't. Now he does what would be considered normal. And it shows us just how great Boaz's action was. The purpose of a foil in a story is to highlight the actions of the main character, or the main character doing the action. So Orpah going back to her family highlights just how much Ruth gave up. The kinsman refusing to redeem Ruth highlights how generous and honorable Boaz was being. And you see that in many, many other stories as well. Minor characters. Minor characters are characters in the story that are not that important, but they're there because they're part of the story. For instance, the foreman in the book of Ruth. Ruth goes to work in the field, and the foreman talks with Boaz. We don't know his name. We don't know anything more about that. He just has a short conversation with Boaz. He's just a minor character. But it's good to find out who the minor characters are. Are there any descriptions of character? Remember I told you that the writers of Scripture didn't have a whole lot of space to write down their stories. And so they didn't give a lot of descriptions. They didn't give a lot of physical descriptions of people. Do we have any descriptions of Adam? What about Abraham? Moses? Do we have any descriptions of Jesus? Not really. It's interesting, though, we do have a very detailed description of Goliath. And there's a reason for that in the story of David and Goliath. So descriptions are important. If there's a description, a physical description of someone, it's important in the story. Also notice names and relationships. Names can be very, very important. For instance, after Hannah prayed to God and God answered her, she named her son Shemuel, which means God hears. And that's significant because he became a prophet, and then for the rest of his life, just his name and his presence reminded God's people that God hears. Now, you've heard me preach on the book of Ruth, and you remember Elimelech was Naomi's husband. Do you remember what his name means? Elimelech. My God is king. So, my God is king left the town of Bethlehem, which means?
House of bread.
Right, Bethlehem means house of bread. He left the house of bread because there was a famine, and he went to the country of Moab. So, was he trusting God to be his king? No, he wasn't. Then, when Naomi comes back from Moab, now her name means what? Naomi means what?
Pleasant.
It means pleasant. She comes back from Moab and she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, which means?
Bitter.
Bitter, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. So you see that names are very important in stories. Not every name. Mahlon and Kilion, we don't know what is significant about their names. So not every name is important, but some names are important in stories. So is there someone who is not called by name? That's an important thing to notice. That sometimes there is a character in the story who is not called by name. Their name is just omitted completely. And you'll notice that the narrator kind of dances around telling us their name. For instance, again, in the story of Ruth, do we know the name of the kinsman redeemer?
Mm-mm.
No, we don't. He's called the kinsman redeemer all the way through, but he's not called by name. He's called by title, not by name. And I think it's significant in the story. Another thing to look for is, does a main character refuse to call someone by name? For instance, in the story of Sarah and Hagar, Sarah tells Abraham, take my handmaiden to be your wife and have children through her. And so she does. And Hagar has a son named Ishmael, and she begins to look down upon Sarah. And Sarah is so angry, she gets after Abraham, but she refuses to call Hagar by name because she's angry. In the story of David and Nabal, if you remember that story, where the guy mistreats David, and David goes to go kill him. Well, first of all, the guy's name, Nabal, means fool. And his wife even admits that. Nabal is his name, and he is foolish. But see, when David's going to go kill him, he's so angry with him, he says, in vain have I been nice to this. He doesn't even call him a man. He just calls him a this. He can't call him by name. He can't call him by anything except a this. He's so angry. So, does a main character refuse to call someone by name? Pay attention to that. Also, look, is there a relationship term that is used? In the story of Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, they're walking up the mountain together, and the narrator reports a conversation between them. And it says, Abraham took the wood and placed it on Isaac, his son. And then they're walking along together, and Isaac says to his father, my father. And Abraham says, here I am, my son. And so we're hearing these relationship terms, father, son, father, back and forth. What's Moses doing as he writes that? He's pointing out the close relationship between them, father, son, back and forth. Okay, so look for relationship terms that are being used. So those are the two main things we're covering today. The boundaries of a story. Where does the story start and stop? What are the major sections? The background, the crisis, the resolution, the conclusion. And then the main characters. The protagonist, who's the main person that the story is about. The antagonist, who is against the protagonist. The foil is someone who, by their actions, highlight just how bad or how good the main character's actions are. Minor characters, descriptions of characters, names, and relationships. Okay? So, your homework is to take chapter 7, verses 3 through 15, and work through steps 1 through 7 as best you can. So up to the ECI. You're to identify the ECI, but pay special attention to the reading before and after. As we've discussed, you're going to do that in more detail. Identifying the boundaries and all the different sections of the story, as we talked about, and the main characters, as we talked about. Got it? So chapter 7, verses 3 through 17. And go steps 1 through 7. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.